Yeah, perfectly audible.
Great. Let me just grab my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening government will be forwarding 3 claims in this debate. First, I'm going to explain why advocacy that goes toward legal recognition is significantly less effective in terms of advocacy and therefore less likely to materialize on their side of the house. Then I'm going to explain why influencing general government policy is a prerequisite to securing economic capital and therefore rights in the long term. And finally, I'll explain why we insulate indigenous people from policy reversals and backlash. Before that, 2 points of setup. We think that the kinds of policies we likely envision defending on our side are indigenous people supporting things like broad-based welfare programs, wealth redistribution in a general sense, and influencing government policy to be more socially egalitarian, e.g. the promotion of equal opportunity initiatives across various minority groups. We think what the advocacy looks like on side up are special statuses for indigenous people like the Maori in Australia and New Zealand, or in Canada with the Haudenosaunee in New York. Policies that specifically recognize the harms that were done to these indigenous people and offer them special status within the community, or things like reparations, which are direct policies which benefit the community in recompense for historical wrong. Second, and this is fairly intuitive, this debate is about broad prioritization and takes place in contexts where these people have neither, right? Where they don't have extant recognition or not enough recognition, right? Otherwise, there's no comparative within the round. Why is the advocacy that goes toward legal recognition far less likely to happen, materialize, or be effective on their side of the house? The reason this matters as a point of preemptive weighing is because even if theoretically speaking, it is more morally legitimate to support opposition in this debate, i.e. if they can prove that their advocacy is more principally legitimate and more in accordance with the community's preferences, if I can prove that practically their advocacy is less effective and less likely to accrue material change for indigenous people on the ground, we win this debate anyway, because access to this material change is a prerequisite for these communities to secure any tangible benefits that allow them to feed their family, to actualize their conception of the good life to begin with. There are 5 broad reasons for this. The first is that it's far harder to generate buy-in for support for your policy from mainstream activist social justice groups and advocates for redistributive welfare and broader society more broadly. Because on opposition, the kinds of policies you support, like reparations, are targeted narrowly to your specific community or involve recognition for your community. And usually there are many poor people and many different minorities in society who may not be indigenous. When you support narrow policy that is prescriptive and highly specialized to your community, it is far harder to mobilize the kinds of sustained support for protests, to get as many donations to your causes, to put as much pressure on lawmakers through electoral campaigns, and so on. What this means is that best for side opposition, they get an involvement with competing incentives whereby larger social justice groups may still support indigenous people on either side, but are doing it in competing priorities where they're constantly channeling donations to various different groups because they have different priorities at different stages. The comparative is on our side. The support for our cause is likely to be far larger because you don't divide these resources in this particular way. The second reason it's harder to get policy quite intuitively on their side is the policies they advocate for on their side require governments to apologize and admit a wrongdoing. This is anathema to not only many conservatives, but many moderates who often instilled from a young age through things like curricula and education, ideas about nationalism and so on and so forth, that make him very averse to admitting wrongdoing in the first place. As an intuition, this is why many programs aimed at alleviating poverty in the Black community in the United States never get off the ground, because these specific redistributive programs that are targeted at this community are simply far less palatable to conservatives who don't want to reckon with America's past. On our side of the house, when we create new programs sui generis, it's far more likely that governments don't have to get the stopgap of apologizing and are therefore more likely to generate support at the point at which this policy is being formulated. But thirdly, you're likely to get far more advocacy within the community. There are 2 broad subclaims for this. The first is that it's easier to expect your policy to be denied by opposition because people have often been asking for recognition in indigenous communities for years and years and years to no avail. They're predisposed to be apathetic about further new initiatives, whereas there's an expectation not only among indigenous people, from a wide variety of people in society, that the government exists to provide for the people and provide a bare minimum of social redistribution and acceptance for wide numbers of people. Therefore, it's likely that greater mobilization, it seems more feasible in the minds of people. But secondly, it's harder to convince members of your own community to buy in on their side, because many indigenous people are pragmatic, right? In that, like any other person, they largely want to live the life they choose, free of interference from the state or harmed by other groups. It's difficult to generate support from internally the indigenous communities when you connect it to historical grievances that have less attachment to their day-to-day life, i.e. the inability to put food on the table, the inability to feed their families, the inability to have a job that pays well or advance their career or build up and upskill their CV in the face of rampant automation that affects indigenous communities far more broadly. So it's hard to consider that has any real relevance to their life, even if some people in the indigenous community believe it does. But finally, I think it's far easier for oppositional narratives about minorities who want special treatment to take hold. So conservatives and people in the political center who who are obviously hostile to conservatives will always be hostile on either side. But it's far harder for them to deploy this narrative in a manner that's palatable to moderates in our world, where they couch their advocacy in broad-based social change rather than specific benefits to a single minority group, which will always be more of a lightning rod. The second claim I want to make is why influencing government policy is a prerequisite toward achieving social change. Note that many indigenous people are economically deprived for a variety of intuitive reasons, a history of structural oppression, intersectional concerns, and things like this, and so on and so forth. I posit firstly that governments are likely far more receptive to policies that are being advocated for by a broad base of people. The reason this is the case is A, it's far easier to market your cause to sympathetic people who are more likely to bandwagon with you and piggyback off your social movement at the point at which you're able to gain more attention by collaborating with them. That is to say, you're far likely to exact concessions when you have broader base support for your protests. You're able to generate more of them, and you get more collective action at every given time. It is when your indigenous protest that's advocating for a very narrow subsection of indigenous recognition attracts only maybe 500 people as opposed to 10,000, there is far less incentive for governments to listen to you in the first place and respond with social change. But secondly, when you integrate with other social movements, you get a seat in the table within that social movement. This means they're more likely to listen to you and prioritize indigenous concerns within their advocacy. The comparative is you divide it, as I've already explained, which is likely harmful. The final thing I want to note here is it's far more sustainable policy, because you get far less widespread backlash when you aren't targeting this like wide segments of the electorate with the idea that the country needs to apologize for a harm that was done. Before I unpack this claim and explain why it's incredibly beneficial, I'd like to engage with closing opposition.
So if your claim is that you're not advocating for reservation-specific policies, but just like a larger welfare state, how on earth are you going to guarantee that resources of a larger welfare state actually go to reservations in indigenous communities?
Precisely, because the comparative is that advocacy likely happens for a distribution on either side of the house. However, that advocacy is A, more effective when you have critical mass, which happens when indigenous people participate because they add volume to those protests. But B, when indigenous people participate in that broad-based welfare system, they're more likely to be able to advocate internal to the movement that redistribution goes to those communities. Thirdly, I just think that indigenous people do benefit from broad-based redistributive policies. That is, a broader social safety net and more access to hospitals means more indigenous communities get those hospitals. Free healthcare or subsidized healthcare means indigenous people get access to that because they're just less likely in general due to economic deprivation to have access to those things in the first place. So we get spillover effects to a large number of degree. This leads to my final point, which is that indigenous people, because of their historical place, are more likely to benefit from the knock-on effects of this policy. That is, when they accrue economic capital as a result of this wealth redistribution and access to our policy, they're likely to benefit to the maximal degree because of the history of repression to the large extent, because they are the most vulnerable, even if this policy is generalizable. The final thing I want to talk about is about policy reversals. On either side, this might happen. There are conservative governments that come into power. It's far harder to happen when many people benefit from them, and there's a vested interest in conservatives not taking away those benefits from their own group as well as indigenous people. So the policy is more sticky and stays in place longer on our side of the house, as well as being more beneficial. Opposition is both ineffective and likely worse for indigenous people. Incredibly proud to stand in OG.
Great. I'd like to thank PM for his fine speech. Ella, whenever you're ready. To thank Ella for a fine speech. By DPM whenever they're ready.
Hey, am I audible?
Yeah, perfectly audible.
Great. Sorry. Okay. Get through with speech quick. It's the second half of extra time in the Argentina game. Wait. Holy fuck, guys, they scored. They scored. Holy shit. Okay, sorry. The game's on in the background. Messi scored. Was it? I don't know. It was Messi, but it was Argentina. Argentina were winning 3-2. Is it okay if we like wait like 1 second while I watch the highlight? Like I really want to see the goal.
I have no preference, so
Okay.
Maximize utility, sure.
Yeah, I'm not prepping. You can see like my hands are here. Don't worry. Okay, I just want to see if Messi's. Yeah, Messi scored. It crossed the line. He did it. Okay, I'm just gonna get through this in like 7 minutes. We're gonna handle this really quickly, and then Matt can handle POIs. Great. 3, 2, 1. I think the biggest flaw that exists in O's case is that they don't really prove why this is more likely, even if they get the benefits. That is to say, if we agree, like if I were to agree with them and say that their policies are more irreversible because once you get the legal status, it's hard to like take back. It also means it's hard to implement in the first place, right? And I'm going to give a bunch of reasons why, but the very intuitive one at the top is usually legal recognition and change of constitutions require super majorities. So it might be hard to reverse, but it's also hard to get to that point in the first place. We'd prefer more, even if there are unstable policies, ones that are able to directly benefit people, at least in the short term, or ones that are more likely to change people on the or help people on the ground. A few things in the speech. Firstly, why the benefits are likely to actually trickle down. The first kind of claim or pushback that we get from opposition. One, note redistribution, whatever the service is, whether it's welfare, transportation services, healthcare, etc., usually goes by income brackets, no matter who you are or what identity you carry. So indigenous people tend to be poor based on the own characterization of opposition. They are disenfranchised insofar as they say, oh, we need them to have access to proper education, etc. So it means that all of the benefits that they say are likely to be accessed primarily more by them. But secondarily, note that disenfranchised groups, no matter who they are, including indigenous people, tend to use those government services substantially more. So it's likely that the benefit actually goes substantially farther in that redistribution insofar as they depend on that access substantially more. But even if you buy none of that, I think the weighing is going to be, in some cases, we might get some of our policy. In some cases, they might get theirs. The question you're going to adjudicate is which is more probable or which scenario is going to be more likely, even if we don't get all of the benefits that O want us to have. So a few things taking out, So why is legal recognition very unlikely to materialize on their side? One, it requires governments to apologize and recognize wrongdoing. But I want to be very clear and very surgical with this. Why is this anathema to voters and governments themselves? One, voters tend to punish governments who are viewed as weak, who are not strong, not fulfilling the advocacy or the power, or the will, or the spirit of the state as being strong. Secondarily, it implicitly says that previous administrations are wrong for not doing so earlier, because you were saying we are doing this action and recognizing a historical event that should have been done earlier, which implicitly punishes the previous administrations before them that people have adherence to and that are from their own party. But thirdly, it requires demonizing historical figures as well, whom everyone in society reveres, who founded the nation, who promoted the nation to advance further. But fourthly, people just don't like to apologize for crimes that they were essentially not alive for, and that their ancestors committed, even if they believe they committed them in the first place. Secondarily, the one that I highlighted at the top, the kind of legal recognitions they talk about are one, actually I'm going to say a little bit more reversible, because they can be challenged in courts, especially ones that are being super PAC'd by conservatives who will never uphold them in the first place. But secondarily, to get them implemented in the first place and require constitutional changes, those are very sticky to actually put in, or not sticky, those have high barriers of entry because their constitutions are designed not to be able to be changed so quickly. So even if they are less irreversible, they are harder to implement in the first place and therefore less likely to materialize, especially with divided parties right now, and the way that only like 51% ever gets the vote. Thirdly, it's very easy to deny. Why? One, because they have been doing so for a long time, which means that the public and the people who are doing this advocacy have implicitly not expected it to actually be promoted or given to the public. However, they do expect some degree of government services to be improved and given because it has been increasing over time. So in other words, there's less advocacy that is possible because people don't expect it and and it's easier for the government to say, listen, we didn't give you this before, you're not pushing as much for it now. But secondarily, history is able to be manipulated, i.e. you can point to some historical gap or claim and claim that the whole claim for recognition is over-exaggerated because there's also historiographical issues insofar as so much culture was destroyed. But if you don't buy any of that, for the larger claims like self-determination that are not based on like historical, just historical recognition, there are two categories here. Ones that don't impact anyone else, like school teachings on reservations. This is unlikely to be a question in this debate, insofar as it's very easy to implement on either side because it doesn't impact non-Indigenous people. That is to say, it's never a voting issue as to whether the people are learning Inuit on the reservation schools, you're not going to vote for this Democratic candidate. It's very rare that this actually becomes an issue because it doesn't affect the direct voting populace. But secondarily, for ones that do impact the voting populace, like literally fucking giving away land, I think there's virtually no chance of this being passed insofar as one, you literally have to take land away from people, or if you don't have to take land away from people, it's literally just property, or if it's not, it's literally viewed as the property of the non-Indigenous people and country. So you're going to be the individual that is accused and demonized for giving the soil of the country away to people who don't want to associate with that country, for demonizing the voters and the people who are supposed to put you in power. It's an irreversible attachment that people have to their country's soil. But fourthly, I think the movement is also up these strategies are likely to defer to more extremist actions and claims as the issues become about historical trauma. What do I mean by this? Movements tend to be to some degree decentralized. You can't control every individual that is out there protesting, etc. When this becomes the main issue in the main forefront, you are more likely to aggravate the core identity of individuals who are less likely to advocate on the same pattern or follow the same hierarchical structure that you need to get the advocacy you want, because they're attached to the history and they're likely to be more unforgiving because of the sheer amount of brutality they experience. So it's less likely that you get a less respectable form that is likely to appeal to the people that you need to actually change those laws. Why are general government policy comparatively more likely to be implemented? One, it just aligns with the interests of other people. That is to say, Black people, Latin Americans, whatever other minorities exist in states, because they have a direct financial incentive in order to do so, but there's also historical precedent. That is say the 60s and 70s people pushed for more government services. It aligns with the interests of those people. Before more analysis, quick, Theo.
I'm still not sure why for these general policies you need Indigenous people involved in these movements, given that they have very little leverage over these movements, even if they join, since there are so many other people in the movement, and given that there are very few Indigenous people who are likely to join these movements on your side.
So I don't think they're incredibly small. If they are incredibly small, then it seems like they wouldn't be able to get any sort of policy on either side of this debate. But secondarily, they need to be able to push for the movement, to be able to push for redistribution within their own areas, within their own reservations. So we say that it is a broad package they are pushing with other groups in order for them to get a taste of that big cookie that they are trying to get. Secondarily, why is general government policy comparatively more likely? It's more relatable. Everyone knows the importance of healthcare and money and being able to raise your child. Not everyone can relate or understand the cultural erasure that otherwise existed. Now, what is the weighing here? General government policy is likely to be more representative of Indigenous interests. Why? It's hard to quantify how much each person cares about recognition of past grievances, or the fact that not the majority of people live on the reservations. Or even if they do, it's hard to know exactly how much of the benefits they will actually materialize, insofar as I already proved to you it's unlikely. The comparative difference is that every non-Indigenous person has to exist with the government service of the state they reside in, has to engage in a commodified society where their income that they are able to generate or keep represents the ability for them to access their own preferences and further their identity further. I think Argentina looks like they're going to win. There's about 4 minutes left. Proud to propose, and I hope Messi can get it.
Great. I'd like to thank DPM for the fine speech. DLO, whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm just checking that I'm audible.
Yeah, perfectly audible.
Awesome. I'll take points in the chat, starting in 3, 2, 1. In Australia, all colonialism since 1780, all of the suffering, all of the dispossession, the immense traumatic loss brought upon Indigenous people in Australia has been based on a legal fiction, the central legal fiction of terra nullius, which says that prior to colonization, this land where I am currently, was not owned by anyone, that Indigenous people were not really human, that they did not have claim over those resources, that their societies did not count. Resources can never redress that fiction fully, because that is a denial of humanity that can only be redressed by challenging people to properly reflect on that erasure of truth and culture. And that's why I was so proud to oppose in this debate. Two things in this speech. Firstly, which form of advocacy is more likely to succeed? And then secondly, on quality of outcome. Firstly, on which advocacy is more likely to succeed. And the framing I want to do here is just that what matters is clearly the extent to which this advocacy acts as a tipping point, not to which the advocacy is abstractly beneficial. Opening government explains that in an abstract sense, advocacy for better social policies might be more appealing than this, but they do very little analytical work to explain why specifically Indigenous people must participate in that process, why they are the tipping point. They do not explain what uniquely is achieved. And I would note that progressive movements in post-colonial countries often do care a lot about Indigenous struggles. Like if you go to any like lefty thing in Australia, there will definitely be a land acknowledgement there. Like progressives have an incentive to suggest to people within their movement they care a lot about struggles of colonialism. These are big conversations in post-colonial countries, which suggests that probably these issues get talked about anyway. But I would note that Indigenous people are far less likely to have success in these movements for a set of reasons. The first is that they are less unique. There are lots of claims on resources, lots of communities that suffer disadvantage. Opening government does not explain why these people will not be crowded out by bigger groups who have just more numerical power, have more funding comparatively. Indigenous people are like literally the most oppressed people on the planet, the most disadvantaged people in these societies. It is so unclear why they're able to win out. Secondly, Indigenous people have a less unique and politically cohesive message. Indigenous people disagree on questions of social policy. It is unclear why they unite behind these policies. But additionally, they're likely to be less passionate, because note how non-specific and abstracted from Indigenous experiences this is. This is like, oh, it'd be nice to have more hospitals. Challenges for legal recognition are so moving. Like, for instance, in an Indigenous icon in Australia, Eddie Mabo, possibly like the iconoclast, right, of Indigenous movements in Australia, campaigned for land rights. And that is a deeply moving struggle because it involved reflecting on the unique history of his people. It reflected on what had been taken away. That is far more moving, far more unique, something which they are likely to be far more impassioned about. The final thing I would note is Indigenous people are probably treated somewhat poorly in these movements, just to the extent that they're crowded out, that it's harder for them to get attention, it's harder for them to get a say. Where movements for legal recognition are overwhelmingly centered around First Nations people, you also probably just get less burnout and stuff like that. The final thing I want to do is explain why comparatively the likelihood of legal stuff is better. And the first thing I'm going to do is just respond to the GovBench claim about radicalism. A couple of problems with this claim. The first is to say that it is empirically wrong. Both, I think, government bench teams so far have admitted that there are a series of legal recognitions that have already occurred in post-colonial countries. There are already special designations, there are already reservations, there are already land rights in lots of countries. That suggests that these things are achievable. So, you know, like this clearly is just something that you can win. It has happened in many countries. The second thing to say, though, is that it uses less resources because it is for a specific group. So it is unclear that it appears that radical. The third thing to say is that this is less important. The political popularity is less important if you're challenging things in court, because that is not a politicized system to the same extent. The final thing to say is just that all of that stuff about like, oh, you have to like rebuke former people. Like, no, this is an opportunity to move on. This is an opportunity to build your political legacy. For example, in Australia, Kevin Rudd did a famous apology speech for the stolen generations that was immensely politically powerful. His legacy will always be remembered as having done that. This is something which sets people apart in a way that like just improving hospital funding cannot. The final thing to say is that this is less reversible, as we tell you. The only responses we get is that means it's harder to get, which is asserted, and that maybe it gets challenged in court, but they don't explain why that challenge is likely to succeed. Presumably, if the judges decide in the first instance that they were probably right, like statistically. And I think clearly being comparative, political mechanisms are likely to be far more reversible. So that's why I think success is actually probably better on our side of the debate. I'm going to take a point from closing now.
Yeah, acknowledgement of countries obviously exist, but the problem is with pushing this further. So you need to explain to us why the social advocacy is likely to be able to push the current boundary of limitation with like, we've done enough with acknowledging country.
What? Like 20 years ago, you'd be like, oh, you need to explain why we can get land rights, but they got them, right? all of the reasons why advocacy has worked, that it's about reaching reconciliation, that it's emotive, that it means a lot to people, continue to be true. All right, quality of outcome. The first thing I'm going to do is just add a bit more substantive here, which is to say, even if this is unsuccessful, even if we don't get policy change, this is an important process of truth telling. It's important that people tell their stories. This is a process of grappling, even if it does not result in important policy outcomes, which we think it does. It is important that Indigenous people have a platform and have a movement to express the trauma and suffering of colonialism, a harm that is unique to Indigenous people. That is incredibly important because that trauma creates bad outcomes in a way additional and actually like the dwarfs deprivation of resources. Like the fact that people have this intergenerational trauma that is so difficult to work through, that does not get recognition, being able to have that represented, to have that heard is in and of itself an enormous benefit. But doing that reflection unlocks future benefits because the more people are forced to hear these stories, the more they're forced to relate, even if they're a bit controversial to start off with, allows you to build momentum and allows you to build political capital for change, build demand and sympathy into the future. That was hugely important. The final thing I'm going to say is just that resources are likely to be pretty bad. And I think that our opening government, like to note, largely agrees with our stuff about self-determination. Like they don't rebut it at all. So I think that stands and is super important. Contrast that with resources, which are super speculative, the extent to which they're beneficial. Oftentimes, redistribution just does not help Indigenous people for the reason that claims on resources are highly contested. It's very difficult to make sure that resources go to the right places, but also they have to be implemented right. Many Indigenous people are treated terribly in hospitals. They die on operating tables because of medical racism. More funding does not fix that because of the deep sense of racism that is not redressed unless you have a truth-telling process, unless you are honest about the colonial past. That was the largest benefit in this debate. Even if we got no policy change, having people tell their stories, expressing what was taken for them, like clearly wins this debate. So proud to oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank Theo for the fine speech and also speaking to top us in a great debate so far. With the backup and government whenever you're ready.
Just checking you can hear me.
Yeah, perfectly audible.
We think that opening opposition are totally correct when they say that legal recognition is ultimately the pinnacle and benchmark of success in relation to Indigenous advocacy, which is why we're going to explain to you at Closing Government that it is only when you focus on government policy in the short term that you are actually ever able to accrue the benefits that opening opposition cares so deeply about. So that's going to be our first piece of extension. But our second piece of extension is going to explain why we're able to get far better benefits to people on the ground in the short term and why those benefits ought to be weighed more highly than what we were given at opening government in relation to why advocacy is likely to be successful. Let's start with why we're more likely to get recognition in the long term under our side. But the fact that the focus of opening government's case is why government policy is more likely to get through. So what we're going to do at closing is we're going to use that rhetoric to explain that considering this policy will be successful, why does it then allow us to get this recognition in the long term? Note the fact we're also going to co-opt the benefits of opening opposition. But the problem with opening opposition is they never explain why the impetus and need for this recognition exists right now in the present. We're going to explain to you why, even if we get it in the long term, we're able to accrue all of their principal benefits. 3 reasons why we think we're more likely to get this recognition in the long term. Firstly, we're able to shift the over to window. Note the fact that by doing things like starting discussions, we're able to do things like raise awareness because as opening government tells us this policy will be successful, that means that we're able to hugely raise awareness within government. We're able to raise awareness within the public and within the media. And that means that we're able to build a huge amount of public sympathy. And that public sympathy can be used and weaponized and manipulated in a positive way to then be able to prove why those legal rights are so important in the long term. Secondly, the community is able to mobilize in a way that's incredibly helpful. 3 reasons why this is true. Firstly, when the government policy is successful, Indigenous people can see themselves that the government has the ability to push benefits through. And that is when they feel more mobilized, and people who currently in the status quo, as OG says, are pragmatists, are able to involve themselves more highly in the movement because they see that it has been successful and they no longer see it as a waste of time. Second of all, it means that people are more politically enfranchised. That means that they are less offside because we think one of the main reasons why a lot of individuals are offside in the status quo is because so little has been done, by indigenous policy. We think if this government policy goes through, that's going to be able to get that legal recognition. Finally, though, in relation to welfare means that they are more able to mobilize and are more able to be active. That's because they are less isolated and less stressed. Third mechanism here, though, is why we're able to get more indigenous representation in Parliament that can then be used to get these land rights and legal recognition through in the long term. 3 reasons why. 1, obviously we don't get things like quotas, but what we do get is indigenous leaders being politicians, because that's often how they are successful in pushing that policy through. So I think the mechanism that opening misses is that in order to get their claims of government policy getting through, often the way in which that is successful is through pushing through indigenous specific representation and leaders, and that is the trajectory under the status quo. Secondly, though, we're able to do things like voting stations in communities, and thirdly, we're able to do things like outreach and voter registration, no things which opening government talks about. So all of that means that you are more likely to get the claims that opening opposition wants to claim in the long term. So what does this mean? It means that the government is more willing to accept for a few reasons. It means they are equipped with the knowledge that we have from policy discussions. It means that they are increased in their sympathy, but it also means that policy is seen as less radical. Note the fact this also applies to the public, because now the idea of getting legal recognition and land rights is perceived as less ambitious because you have the precedent of these other government policies that are less intense and less radical. And note the fact that the government policy is far more diverse in what it aims to achieve. So you are able to get, you can get smaller concessions in the short term before you reach for the moon and get the legal land rights and concessions in the long term. Why do we think this outweighs our opening? It is because we explained to you why we are able to get what I think every team recognizes to be extremely important, and explain why those things are more likely to accrue in the long term. Secondly, let's talk about why we're able to bring benefits to people on the ground in the short term, because I don't think opening government ever fully explain what the actual benefits of the policy which they are proposing actually are. And we're going to explain to you what they are fourfold. I'll take closing though.
Closing, sorry?
Yep, I'll take closing.
Yeah, your first extension is contingent on these being smaller concessions, but massive large-scale economic redistribution that affects everyone's tax money and reduces the well-being of a lot of people with privilege is not a smaller concession for the indigenous community.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's just like, you've just given a reason why welfare generally is hard to get through. And clearly that's not true in most of the developed world, right? Like the places in which these debates are occurring, anti-colonial states, are generally just pretty good at distributing welfare because the voters actually tend to care about them a huge amount. Like I think that's proven literally everywhere across the world. So I don't think it's true that you're actually shooting for the stars when you get things like welfare. I think it is far easier to get these smaller concessions, but also the way the government conceptualizes giving welfare is very different to the way the government conceptualizes giving land ownership and legal recognition, because in giving that legal recognition, they need to question themselves as a government and recognize that they've done the wrong thing. And we think it's far harder for governments to realize their own mistakes than it is to be like, we will give you welfare. I think it's just like an easier policy for them to get through. Secondly, why do we get benefits for people on the ground? 4 things here. 1, welfare is incredibly useful to these communities. That's because one of the key issues facing Indigenous communities are things like really high unemployment, really high poverty, really high levels of homelessness, and low levels of education. So when we're able to do things like increase standards of living, that just alleviates people out of huge amounts of misery. Second of all, we're probably able to also get things like less policing. We don't think that you need the self-determination OO talks about to get things like circle sentencing, for example. They don't require recognition of legal and land rights. Thirdly, we're able to increase education levels. We have more money to put into things, for example, like teaching a native language, to put into things like building more schools in areas that are highly populated by Indigenous communities. But finally, as we've already mentioned in our previous extension, if we're able to get things like increased Indigenous leaders, things like outreach voting areas, things like increasing voter registration, that is hugely beneficial. Because we do things like reduce barriers to pre-selections, we increase the minimum percentage for parties perhaps, we also decrease the cost to apply for politics, because when the medium-term benefits of welfare start to flow through to those communities, that's when people become more politically empowered and are more likely to join parties. And that eventually is when we're able to mobilize people and actually use them to be able to push through the policy which Op Bench cares so deeply about. At the end of this speech, you should believe 2 things from closing government. Firstly, we're the only team that explains to you how we are actually feasibly able to get the legal recognition and why that is an important thing. But second of all, we tell you that in the short term, at least we're able to get benefits to people on the ground economically, and that is incredibly unique from closing government.
Great. I'd like to thank the Member of Government for the fine speech. Invite Member of Opposition to begin the case for closing opposition whenever they're ready.
If you have POIs, please offer them in the chat. Unfortunately for opening opposition, all of their benefits about self-determination rely on the actual likelihood of getting this kind of policy change. Aside from assertions about this being important to political legacy and the fact that it has already happened, I'm unclear why this policy change is going to accrue. Our first extension is going to claim why it's highly plausible to get meaningful forms of self-recognition, and then we're going to do a better job of impacting why this recognition is important for the long-term enfranchisement of communities. Class will be integrated. Why is it actually feasible that we're going to get recognition under our side of the house? I want to start by responding to each of the three main claims that we get from opening government here and flip them. The first thing that we get is that this requires governments to apologize. First, they will question whether you always need to apologize to have things like treaty recognition occurring. You can often just do it without issuing a formal apology. But secondly, I think the political will is shifting in the vast majority of states that have indigenous populations in ways where apologies are becoming increasingly politically plausible. Societies are becoming more progressive over time, particularly in the realm of recognizing previous colonial wrongs. Number one, progressive change happens by people struggling against unjust systems over time. Number two, the proliferation of social media means that it's easier for progressives to share their stories that exist. And number three, there are other social justice movements in society campaigning for things like anti-colonialism, given that most minorities and most minority religions within your state were afflicted by it, moving like academic consensus, for example, toward more anti-colonial strains of thought that are going to exist. Note that this like characterization of increasing progressivism is prior to opening opposition's argument that politicians are going to apologize and stuff because it's valuable for their political legacy. They're only going to want to do that when it's politically feasible, which is therefore hung on our characterization that progressivism is becoming the more dominant political strategy within the vast majority of states. The next thing that we hear from opening government is that other minority groups have unique needs and therefore won't support this. I have two observations here. And the first thing to say is that there's no way the unique needs of other minority groups are being harmed via our policy. The Black Lives Matter movement can campaign for defunding the police, which is not trade-offable with getting legal status recognition for this Indigenous community. Given that changes aren't zero-sum, I'm unclear there's not going to be mutual support for different policies that are going to exist. Secondly, I actually think that sympathy from other minority communities and from the majority in general toward forms of like treaty-based recognition is actually going to be relatively high. The reason for this is that the baseline argument that Indigenous communities use to campaign for recognition centers on one of forms of cultural differences and distinctiveness, which often have religious insinuations as well. For example, this piece of land is very religiously significant to us. It's important to our customs. There's an argument that is able to relate to a lot of majority individuals, because a lot of people in society are like religious or know other religious people. And even aside from freedom of religion, this underpins the vast majority of constitutional arguments in favor of liberty in general. So Indigenous communities can couch their right-based claims through the realms of I have a right to liberty, I have a right to self-determination, which is analogous to your claims to freedom of religion, providing arguments that are actually able to resonate with a substantial number of people. The final claim that we hear for opening government is that Indigenous communities are pragmatic and therefore aren't going to value this kind of change. My first response to this is that your side is based on a false conception of what pragmatism actually is, because for a lot of Indigenous communities, self-determination is viewed as being a means to an end to attain a better kind of pragmatism. When you're able to better kick out oil companies, when you have control over your legal system, these are things that are seen as being a pragmatic good. My second response to this is that their side of the house relies on Indigenous communities thinking that government-based policy change is going to be pragmatic for them. Given centuries of abuse by government structures, campaigning for policies that have to work through the vessels of the government will actually have more of an alienating effect in terms of encouraging individuals to opt into these kind of movements at the end of the day. Given that I've flipped the vast majority of Gov, what is your positive mechanism for actually getting this kind of change? Firstly, Indigenous communities can form coalitions with other Indigenous communities within their states. We agree with opening opposition that there tends to be divisiveness around social policy for different reservations, but what is agreed to is that no matter which tribe you belong to, all tribes benefit from getting self-recognition of their own territory. So you're not campaigning for controversial things, rather you're just campaigning for things on the basis of, I want a right to be recognized, meaning that different Indigenous communities can push for these kinds of things. Secondly, though, all we have to do is just shift the Overton window by getting these grievances popularized in the mainstream media, and therefore getting other progressives to pick up their causes. Given our frame about the proliferation of social media, when this is introduced, parties are more likely to adopt these kind of things into their platform on the political left, meaning that it can actually be created at the end of the day. The next thing I want to talk about then is the value of change and give better reasons in our opening, but before that, I'll take opening.
The reason our benefits are mutually exclusive is because your side pitched social movements at cross purpose with each other. Even marginally more money is more comparative than CG's extension is contingent on us. You might have flipped all of our stuff. I'm
okay, you can type the other teams. That's too much of a POI, but also we prove why they're not mutually exclusive with each other, because the change doesn't harm each other. But you know what is mutually exclusive? If you are campaigning for more welfare funding to Indigenous communities, you're going to take money away from other rich people within your own communities. Why is the value of change substantially higher? Opening opposition talks about the principle of reparation and giving people back. I think that this is important, but the reparative wrong that stays committed to Indigenous communities was not just a principled one. It was a practical one. It was taking your children away. It was robbing them of money and resources. Therefore, I think that the practical reparation is a comparatively more important one to fulfill, given that it's a larger facilitator of agency when I have more goods to actually improve my quality of life. There's two key ways that recognition of communities is beneficial for this. The first is you have more control over economic projects that are occurring within your territory. A massive issue that exists under the status quo are governments trying to build oil pipelines and other natural resource extractive projects in indigenous communities. Note that this stuff are not essential for the creation of these projects, i.e. you could reroute them in other areas at a slightly higher cost. But given the fact that indigenous communities have substantially lower levels of political capital that are going to exist, they often don't care about the plight is actually going to cause to indigenous communities at the end of the day. Note that the products are often devastating for indigenous communities. Firstly, you have massive cultural problems, which cultural harms, which often involve building on very culturally and religiously important things. Secondly, it often involves the pollution of waterways. Note that these waterways are responsible for people's drinking water in the vast majority of cases. A lot more people get sick and you worsen the kind of healthcare crisis. And they're also often used by corporations in ancillary projects as well. But thirdly, you build more of the economy off of the oil industry, which often involves the importing of labor for people who are more specialized in that. Whereas there is a capacity for more diversification under our side of the house, as economies in general around the world become more reliant on things like labor. And given this is an untapped market, we can get forms of investment under our side of the house. The second broad way that we help these communities is by a more legal independence that's going to exist. First observation that I want to make is that even if you don't buy that treaty recognition always means independent legal systems, even though in a lot of cases it does, just having status recognition often gives you benefits in the mainstream legal system. So in Canada, we have the Gladue court system, where if you have status and you're being tried in a court that is off reservations, but you're recognized as an indigenous person, you having a potentially looser sentence is going to exist. But in a lot of the time, treaty recognition means you have control over your own legal structures. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, the rampant problem of over-criminalization that exists, where indigenous individuals are tried in mainstream court systems with judges who are often extremely racist, then they even get locked away for decades, as opposed to more minimal forms of punishment like sentencing circles under our side of the house. It worsens on cycles of poverty within their worlds substantially when individuals are not able to work, and they worsen things like intergenerational emotional crisis. But secondly, it's about the buy into the system as well. I'm substantially more likely to report crimes and be willing to rehabilitate when the judge looks like me, when this is a form of punishment which my cultural system supports, rather than one that seems to be Western alienation at the end of the day. How does this interact with closing government? They can't call out the entire debate by being we can get the change eventually, but this is reliant on their change being effective and it being meaningful to indigenous communities. Given that they never analyzed and they solved the gap that opening opposition observes of why will there be trickle-down change to indigenous communities, you're less likely to get forms of recognition into the future because you feel alienated from the movement as a whole. I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Great. I'd like to thank the member of opposition for the fine speech. Government Whip, summarise proposition bench whenever you're ready.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Actions. Just a raise of hand in 5 minutes. CJ reaches for the most ambitious claim in the debate, and that is that in the long term, we can kind of gobble up all the benefits of the opposition bench. And that is because we explain that asymmetrically, shifting government policy empowers future recognition, whereas shifting recognition detracts or leads to significant social backlash, which restricts future government policy. And both CEO in the last dying minutes of that speech, but also I think implicitly in OG's case, really seem to think that this debate is only about the question of which is more easy to achieve, that they're perfectly fungible, that if you do one, you can always get the other later down the line. But they never do any of the proof work of explaining why achieving one directly leads to the ability to achieve the other. And the important thing is, I think it's true to some extent that yes, if it is slightly easier to achieve one goal, you will be able to somewhat achieve the other goal. But that is a reason to suggest that the two are synergistic. That is, that our cases are not in conflict. They are both important contributions to explain how we are able to gobble up the other team's cases. And I think that is the important recognition, that it's not that it being easier is prior to all of the reasons that we give, but you need in hand to achieve this benefit. I think that means that we are more important for the simple reason that our benefit is much bigger than just we get things easier and therefore it's faster and we can get more of it. And most importantly, because it is the only way to achieve long-term change. Both teams recognize that we have an obligation both to provide justice, but also to provide economic stability and realities on the ground government policy. The question is which team is better able to achieve that long-term goal. And so I'm going to start with what opening opposition gives us under this question, because I think their core contention here is that self-determination will lead to better political representation, then it leads to the economic benefits of the debate. The problems are threefold. First, it is that recognition does not necessarily lead to political enfranchisement or empowerment. They never do the actual explanation work on why you having some form of recognition that something was done wrong, that it is true that there are historical grievances, all of a sudden it lets you get a quota in parliament. And that is a huge gap in analysis that I don't think is ever proven. But second is that even if you do get political empowerment to some extent, politics is incredibly fraught. This is a small minority group that now has 3 or 4 seats in parliament. Well done. How do you control political decision making? How is that group not tokenized by the majority and constantly framed as the Maori politicians that are incredibly self-interested and should never realistically have control of parliament? Why is it that politics actually leads to you being able to achieve benefits on the ground? Because even the best politicians with the best intentions and the best incentives often still just struggle to get their political agenda across, then they cannot effectively have that power. But I think the last thing to point out here is if you truly cared about political representation, we gave you the best mechanism to achieve that political representation. Because they say you get a quota enshrined in a constitution. We say political representation was far more achievable when you gave people vote in more accessible voting booths, when you got outreach movements that encouraged them to be able to register, when you just lowered the cost of politicians to be able to sign up and say, I want to represent this political party. Those were far more achievable types of governmental policy change to politically empower people. We did not need to rewrite constitutions to politically empower Indigenous communities. But it's more than that, because we just give so many more mechanisms here about why economic stability empowers individuals politically, how it enables them to lobby the government, how it enables them to form grassroots groups to be able to more effectively do legal advocacy, that one. Individuals such that they actually think the government is reformable. Not to mention, it's not just that we immobilize Indigenous groups, it's all our other analysis that it makes the government more willing to accept this change. When it has this history of giving at least a degree of policy that caters towards these communities, that it makes them more public, more willing. As we slowly shift the Overton window over time to at least to integrate a degree of more organic change, but there's slightly less backlash as these public kind of gets used to the fact that the government is doing slightly more things to Indigenous communities. They're being slightly more vocal over time to shift politics. I think all of this is the actual mechanism about how we can gobble up the opposition case. And closing opposition provides the additional analysis of just like, but better legal protection or better defense or control of individuals' lands is the actual means to achieve these ends. I think all of this is like maybe potentially plausibly true, but we think specifically the problem with legal systems is they were designed from the outset to oppress Indigenous communities.
Okay, I stopped the timer. I don't know if this person just accidentally left the Zoom call, but
yeah, hi, sorry, I think he's just left. I don't know what's happened.
Okay.
Let me
So
just...
don't worry, I paused the timer.
His computer's out of power. He didn't have it in charge. So he's just gonna get a charge. It's gonna be 10 seconds. Sorry, this is
That's okay. No worries.
Sorry.
Hello, sorry about that. That's
No
so
worries.
embarrassing.
I had you at 457, and you're just going to talk about, we're talking about how the legal system is constructed to be systemically oppressive.
Yeah. Sorry, just give me 1 second to reorient myself. Yeah, rather than operating within a legal system that has known for decades to violate treaties that they signed or be used as a tool by the government to suppress Indigenous communities, we think that those particular forms of tools are uniquely ineffective at actually ever eventuating change on the ground. I think it's far, far better to economically, politically enfranchise people through government policy to achieve that long-term change. Before I get to the remaining 2 questions, I'll take opening.
Yeah, I explained structurally in my speech that articulating and recognizing harm uniquely creates persuasive Indigenous activists, it challenges racism, and it builds momentum and social
okay, so this argument falls into the problem of the only way that you can ever feel justice or feel some sense of emotional swaying is by saying that politically your land was taken from you. Like, what? You tell Indigenous communities that the poverty you face on the ground is immoral. You tell Indigenous communities you shouldn't have to deal with the fact you are over-policed on a daily basis. We think this type of government policy is just as emotionally and rhetorically important to individuals as your analysis on justice and that type of stuff. So the second question of the debate then is, which of these is more important? We think we give 2 valuable weighing metrics here. First weighing metric is ours is far more tangible. Because yes, justice and political representation are good, but if we had to pick or choose one, we prefer the one that at least puts food in people's mouths and gives them a more stable existence because it is something that they can feel in reality. The second metric is that it's just more immediate. We think it is so important to begin to break cycles of poverty and criminality as early as absolutely possible. We think these 2 unique weighing contributions explain, even if you think that the opening half is somewhat of a deadlock, why a government material comes up of opposition. The last is to just give some rebuttal on the last question of the debate, which is easier to achieve. As I've already rebutted to that POI, I think the best analysis about how this gives a meaning to people on the ground is just not that important. But the last big thing I want to respond to OO about is they say, you come across as an expert, like you're more ideologically pure under their side. But our guys still come across as experts. They still come across as experts on how to break the poverty cycle in these communities. They still come across as ideologically pure, just working through different systems. And that is why I think almost all of this analysis is quite symmetric in the debate. You ought favor our long-term analysis as the winning contribution.
Great. I can thank the government whip for the fine speech and invite opposition whip to close out the debate for opposition bench and the semi-final as a whole.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're perfectly audible.
Give me a second. Let me take CG out of this debate first. Their claim is we get other Indigenous rights recognized in the long term if we get this general government policy passed first. I have 2 high-level observations about how the rest of my themes in my speech will address CG directly. Number 1, all their reasons collapse into the debate the other 3 teams have been having on which policy change is more feasible. Look at their mechanisms. Shifting the Overton window depends on one policy happening first, that being a bit more palatable, and then you switch the Overton window and make you more open to engage in extreme policies. If we show you that our side, that is legal recognition and status, is more palatable, we beat their extension right there. Their claims about needing welfare to mobilize people are contingent on this welfare reaching Indigenous people and being more important to the material needs of Indigenous people than what Naomi described, which is mass incarceration of Indigenous individuals, which is pipelines destroying their local environments and endangering both their health and their socioeconomic status. Both these observations mean CG's extension is contingent on beating both opposition teams in this debate. That aside, let's address their individual mechanisms. 1, they say we shift the Overton window with public sympathy. 2 problems. First, it conflicts with the POI that CG asked OO, which if we've given them enough is the attitude that people will adopt after passing a particular set of policies. Why will they pass more policies for Indigenous people? If anything, their expectations normalize. People think we're giving them a large amount of their tax revenue. Why do we need to give them more things? Second, if anything, this increases the leverage governments have over indigenous communities, because now indigenous communities are benefiting from general federal government welfare rather than a policy targeted at an indigenous reservation. The problem is you're then dependent on the government welfare scheme. If the government decides maybe we want to reallocate welfare a little bit to another region because our statistics say they are more vulnerable, you can do nothing. You are much more beholden to whatever decisions the majority imposes on you. Second, they say you need welfare to mobilize people. Apart from this being conditional on welfare reaching indigenous communities, the presence of deep harms that Naomi describes, like being worried about a pipeline leak, are far more likely to stop mobilization, because by their own admission, at least you have an existing welfare net in the first world countries that member of government wants to set this in. What you do not have is protection from pipeline leaks and mass incarceration when felons, for example, can't vote in the national election. Finally, they say we access things like voter registration. They don't give you a reason why this doesn't happen on our side. In fact, political empowerment is less likely on their side because indigenous people are less likely to mobilize when mainstream movements are involved. They lack trust in mainstream movements that are littered from people from communities that used to oppress them before. They have to engage in protests and activism outside the communities that they know and have bonds in, and they are engaging and depending on the state that oppressed them. Rather than getting an independent court system, they're trying to get marginal reforms in the existing court system, a court system they already distrust because it is instrumentalized by a state that used it to murder their families. Therefore, if anything, there is far more trust in these movements on our side. I'll ask 3 questions. Question 1, is their advocacy effective? This outweighs opening opposition's principal considerations because the state has an obligation to indigenous people, but to meet that obligation, you have to successfully reach your advocacy first. It also outweighs closing government because closing government's case is dependent on if we get these concessions are good, but do you even get these concessions? So do they get marginal change on our side? Opening government argues that you're able to coalesce with other advocates and therefore mobilize sustained support. There are 2 problems with this. 1, apart from creating a broader base of support, as Naomi explains in her POI response, you create a broader base of opposition too, because indigenous recognition, unlike welfare schemes, aren't a direct trade-off for the majority. On their side of the house, incorporating other social movements mean you have to engage the least common denominator, the least popular social movement succeeding, the least popular social movement getting what it wants is the precondition for any member of that movement getting what it wants. 1, you are advocating a larger number of policies, welfare for more people rather than fewer people. These policies involve much more of a direct trade-off because it's redistributing far more money from ordinary people. Second, these policies often have big macroeconomic effects. Indigenous reservations are fairly small and self-contained. If you are advocating large-scale redistribution that affects everyone in the country and the people with political privilege, it often affects negatively. Third, these policies are happening outside of places like reservations, and therefore other individuals are more invested in whether they happen or not, and the people with the most political power are invested in them not happening. CG says developed countries are good at welfare, failing to engage with the fact that there are many developing countries with massive indigenous populations like Bolivia, where they were segregated and oppressed before Evo Morales came into power. This outweighs opening government's claims about how people are really tied to their national soil, their national identity, being risk-averse to admit wrongdoing. Apart from Naomi's mechanisms, which show why there are trends in the opposite direction that do not get engagement, material needs are always more important to the average American than whether Native Americans get a little more land. You feel more connected to yourself than your national identity. And in fact, the national American identity is often constructed around notions like freedom and low taxes, meaning this affects you directly a lot more and you mobilize against the indigenous movement. But the second is opening government has no marginal effect either. The problem with opening government is these social movements exist anyway, and they never explain what the indigenous social movement adds. All they say is it adds a critical mass, but indigenous social movements are likely to mobilize fewer people on their side when you're advocating general policies rather than things indigenous people grew up thinking about and fighting for. That means you don't get the critical mass of indigenous mobilization, and it's not clear why this indigenous mobilization is the tipping point. Secondly, therefore, is our advocacy comparatively more effective? Opening opposition basically says, we've already got some changes, but they don't explain why you get further changes. And they say things like, you don't get crowded out, you don't lose out in budget redraws, but that assumes you get money in the budget in the first place. Naomi explains why we mobilize voters who uniquely care about these issues. The general population is less invested in whether an indigenous court is set up or not. You need to mobilize a certain number of indigenous people, however, to vote for the setup of such a court, and that's the mobilization we get. But we also explain, one, you can form coalitions with other indigenous communities. Two, you can mobilize protesters who embarrass the government until it gives them concessions. And three, you can couch it in rights-based claims and religious claims that get some degree of support among the general populace, unlike the changes that GovBench wants. Finally, which form of advocacy improves the lives of indigenous people conditional on success? Even if the GovBench gets success, it's not clear why these benefits affect the average indigenous person. Maybe there is a minor welfare expansion on their side, but the welfare expansion is fleeting and can go away quickly. What we say is more important than getting welfare to put food in people's mouths is to prevent people from being incarcerated and prevent their lives from being at risk. And that is the status quo for indigenous reservations. If we get success, if we get indigenous sovereignty, what we do is we stop the construction of awful pipelines and stop the attack on indigenous autonomy we oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank opposition whip for the fine speech. All the videos has been a great semi-final. Hear from you soon.